August 1944. The Moldavian fields become the arena for one of the most brilliant operations in military history. Two Soviet marshals prepare a strike that will go down in history as the Cannae of Jassy-Kishinev. In 8 days, an 800,000-strong enemy force will be crushed, with the ratio of losses reaching an incredible 1-to-20 in favor of the Red Army. How Tolbukhin and Malinovsky outmaneuvered the German generals and changed the course of the war in the Balkans. Subscribe to the channel to learn about the most outstanding operations of the Great Patriotic War. And in the comments, we will discuss: could the German command have prevented the disaster of Army Group South Ukraine if Colonel General Friesner had been given permission to withdraw his troops beyond the Prut River before the Soviet offensive began? The summer of 1944, the Eastern Front is cracking at the seams. After the failure of Operation Bagration, Army Group Center has effectively ceased to exist, and the Red Army is rapidly approaching the borders of East Prussia. But there is one section of the front where the German command still hopes to hold its positions: Moldova and Romania. Here, on the banks of the Dniester and Prut rivers, is a powerful enemy force, Army Group South Ukraine, commanded by Colonel General Johannes Friesner. It consists of General Maximilian de Angelis's 6th German Army, General Otto Wöhler's 8th German Army, and the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies. In total, there are more than 800,000 men, 3,000 guns and mortars, and 400 tanks and self-propelled artillery units. For Hitler, holding this region was critical. Romania was the Reich's last major ally, supplying oil to the German war machine. The oil fields of Ploiești provided up to a third of all fuel for the Wehrmacht. The loss of Romania would mean an energy disaster for Germany and open the way for the Red Army to the Balkans. The German command understood perfectly well the importance of the Moldovan direction. The best divisions were transferred here, including the elite 24th Panzer Division. Defensive positions were built for months. A system of trenches, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and pillboxes stretched from the Dniester to the foothills of the Carpathians. But the Soviet command was preparing a strike that would become one of the most perfect in military history. The Supreme Command Headquarters was developing an operation capable not only of defeating Army Group South Ukraine, but also of radically changing the strategic situation throughout the southern section of the Eastern Front. In Moscow, they studied the experience of the great commanders of the past. They analyzed the Battle of Cannae with particular attention, where Hannibal surrounded and destroyed the numerically superior Roman army. Soviet strategists asked themselves, is it possible to repeat Cannae in modern warfare, using tanks, aircraft, and artillery instead of elephants and cavalry? The answer to this question was to be provided by two outstanding military leaders, Marshals Rodion Malinovsky and Fyodor Tolbukhin. Their armies stood on the left and right banks of the Dniester, preparing to strike a blow that would go down in history as the Jassy-Kishinev Cannae. The timing of the operation was not chosen at random. August 20th, 1944, was the day the operation was to begin, which would decide the fate of Romania and open the way for the Red Army to the heart of Europe. But did the enemy know about it? Would the German generals be able to figure out the Soviet plan and prevent a catastrophe? The coming days would answer these questions. An atmosphere of anxious anticipation reigned at the headquarters of Army Group South Ukraine. Colonel General Johannes Friesner, appointed commander just a month ago, was well aware of the complexity of his situation. This experienced military leader had risen from battalion commander to army group commander, participating in operations in Norway, Finland, and on the Eastern Front. Freyssner was one of those German generals who realistically assessed the situation. He understood that after the defeat of Army Group Center, the initiative had finally passed to the Red Army. German intelligence reported the concentration of large Soviet forces against the Moldovan section of the front, but there was no accurate information about the enemy's plans. Two Soviet commanders, whose names were already well known on the fronts of the Great Patriotic War, were acting against Freyssner. Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky commanded the 2nd Ukrainian Front. The son of a railway worker from Odessa, he fought in World War I as part of the Russian Expeditionary Force in France, participated in the Civil War, and proved himself to be an outstanding strategist during the Great Patriotic War. Malinovsky was a master of maneuver warfare. His troops distinguished themselves in the battles for Stalingrad, near Rostov-on-Don, and in the operation to liberate Donbass. The Marshal possessed a rare gift of foresight and knew how to exploit the enemy's weaknesses to deliver a decisive blow. Fyodor Ivanovich Tolbukhin, commander of the 3rd Ukrainian Front, was the complete opposite of his colleague. While Malinovsky was famous for his boldness and swiftness, Tolbukhin was known for his methodical and thorough preparation of operations. This former public school teacher began the war with the rank of colonel, and by the summer of 1944, he was already wearing marshal's epaulets. Under Tolbukhin's command, troops liberated Donbass and Crimea and broke through the Blue Line on the Taman Peninsula. The Marshal was known for his ability to save soldiers' lives, carefully plan operations, and achieve maximum results with minimum losses. Now, these two outstanding military leaders were tasked with conducting an encirclement operation against one of the strongest enemy groups. They had at their disposal more than 1.2 million soldiers, 16,000 guns and mortars, more than 1,500 tanks and self-propelled artillery units, and 2,000 aircraft. But numerical superiority did not guarantee success. German troops occupied well-prepared defensive positions, had experienced commanders and high combat training. Army Group South Ukraine controlled all the main communications in the region and could quickly transfer reserves to threatened areas. The key issue was the coordination of the two fronts. Malinovsky was to attack from the north, from the Iasi area, and Tolbukhin from the east, across the lower Dniester. Only synchronized strikes could ensure the success of the encirclement operation. Intense work went on day and night at the front headquarters. General staff officers studied maps, calculated routes, and planned supplies for the troops. The lives of hundreds of thousands of people and the outcome of the entire campaign in the south depended on the accuracy of these calculations. Freyssner also did not waste any time. The German general strengthened his defenses, created reserves, and prepared plans for counterattacks. But he did not yet know what the Soviet marshals were preparing against him. Which strike would they deliver first? Where would they concentrate their main forces? Soon, everything would become clear. The geography of the future battle was unique. Moldova was a hilly plain crossed by the Dniester, Prut, and Siret rivers. This terrain seemed to have been specially created by nature for encirclement operations. The rivers served as natural boundaries, and the relatively open terrain allowed for the effective use of tank units. The Dniester became a natural border between the Soviet troops and the enemy. The river flowed from northwest to southeast, emptying into the Black Sea near the city of Ackerman. The width of the Dniester in the area of the upcoming hostilities reached 100 to 150 meters, and its depth was 3 to 4 meters. The German command considered this water barrier a serious obstacle to the advance of Soviet troops. West of the Dniester was a bridgehead near the town of Cannae, captured by Tolbukhin's troops back in April 1944. This small piece of land on the right bank of the river was of enormous strategic importance. From here, Soviet troops could advance directly on Chisinau, the capital of the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic. The German command understood the importance of the Kitskan bridgehead and made desperate attempts to eliminate it. The best divisions were thrown against the relatively small Soviet forces, but all attacks were repelled. Soviet sappers turned the bridgehead into an impregnable fortress, surrounded by minefields and anti-tank obstacles. In the northwest of the theater of war was the city of Jassy, the ancient capital of the Moldavian Principality, and now an important communications hub. Railway lines connecting Romania with Ukraine converged here. The capture of Jassy opened the road to Bucharest and cut off the retreat routes of the German-Romanian troops. The terrain favored the attacking side. The Moldavian uplands, with heights of up to 400 meters above sea level, allowed artillery observers to see large areas and adjust their fire. Numerous ravines and gullies served as natural shelters for the concentration of troops. The climatic conditions of August 1944 also contributed to the offensive operation. The weather was dry and hot, and the roads were in good condition, which allowed for the effective use of mechanized units. Daylight lasted 14 hours, which made active combat operations possible. German engineers created a powerful defense system in Moldova. The first defensive line ran along the eastern bank of the Prut River and included field fortifications, anti-tank ditches up to 3 meters deep, wire barriers, and minefields. The density of mines reached 2,000 mines per kilometer of the front. The second defensive line was located 10 to 15 kilometers to the west and was even more powerful. Here, the Germans built reinforced concrete pillboxes and created a system of firing points capable of conducting circular defense. Particular attention was paid to anti-tank defense. Camouflaged guns and bazookas were installed. The third line of defense ran along the Foxani-Bako line and was supposed to be the last line of resistance. But the main hope of the German command was not fortifications, but mobile defense using tank reserves and aviation. Moldova's river network provided additional opportunities for defense. All bridges across the Prut, Dniester, and their tributaries were prepared for demolition. The Wehrmacht's engineering troops mined the crossings, created roadblocks, and destroyed vital communications. But the same geography that helped defend could become a trap for the defenders. If Soviet troops managed to cross the rivers and get behind enemy lines, the German-Romanian divisions would find themselves trapped between the Dniester and Prut rivers. This is exactly what Marshals Malinovsky and Tolbukhin were counting on. Would the nature of Moldova become an ally of the Red Army or remain on the side of the defenders? Planning for the Jassy-Kishinev operation began in June 1944. The General Staff of the Red Army, led by Alexei Mikhailovich Vasilevsky, developed an operation codenamed Romanian Gambit. The main idea was to launch a simultaneous attack on 2 fronts with the aim of encircling and destroying the South Ukraine Army Group. The preparations were kept absolutely secret. All documents were marked top secret, and only a small circle of senior commanders knew the plans for the operation. General staff officers worked in isolated rooms, and all calculations were done by hand, without the use of communications. Special attention was paid to misleading the enemy. Soviet intelligence organized a large-scale operation to mislead the German command. False radio communications, fictitious troop movements, and demonstrative engineering work were all intended to convince the enemy that the main strike would not be in Moldova, but in other areas of the front. At the same time, thorough reconnaissance of German positions was carried out. Soviet scouts studied every pillbox, every trench, every minefield. Particular attention was paid to identifying weak points in the enemy's defenses. Aerial reconnaissance photographed German positions daily, recording the slightest changes. Troops were prepared for the operation according to a special program. Infantrymen practiced crossing water obstacles, tankers studied the peculiarities of combat operations in rough terrain, and artillerymen learned to fire directly at fortified positions. Each soldier knew his task, but the overall plan of the operation remained a secret. Logistical preparation was no less important. Quartermaster services created warehouses for ammunition, fuel, and food. Medical units deployed hospitals and sanitary battalions. Engineering troops prepared crossing equipment, pontoons, boats, and temporary bridges. Artillery played a special role in preparing for the operation. The Soviet command concentrated more than 16,000 guns and mortars against Army Group South Ukraine, an unprecedented concentration of firepower. The artillery preparation was intended not only to suppress the enemy's firing points, but also to demoralize its manpower. The Air Force Group numbered about 2,000 aircraft of various types. Attack aircraft were prepared to destroy German tanks and artillery, fighters to gain air superiority, and bombers to destroy enemy communications deep behind the defenses. Particular attention was paid to coordinating the actions of ground forces and aviation. Mixed aviation corps were created, including all types of aircraft. Pilots studied the signals of ground forces, and infantrymen and tankers studied methods of target designation for aviation. The psychological preparation of the troops was no less important than their material and technical preparation. Political workers held talks with the soldiers, explaining the objectives of the operation and the importance of liberating Moldova. Particular attention was paid to fostering a spirit of internationalism. The troops were to liberate the Moldovan and Romanian peoples. A month before the start of the operation, a dress rehearsal was held. A model of the German defenses in Moldova was recreated at a training ground near Voronezh. The troops practiced all stages of the operation, from artillery preparation to pursuing the retreating enemy. The exercises demonstrated the high readiness of the units to carry out combat missions. On the eve of the operation, Marshals Malinovsky and Tolbukhin held a final meeting with corps and division commanders. The plan of action was refined, tasks were assigned, and the meeting points for the advancing groups were determined. Everything was ready for a strike that was to go down in the history of military art. But was the enemy ready to fight back? Would the German generals be able to figure out the Soviet plan and organize an effective defense? There were only a few hours left before the start of the operation, and soon everything would be decided on the fields of Moldova. Romania had always been an unreliable ally of the Third Reich. This country entered the war against the Soviet Union not for ideological reasons, but solely in the hope of regaining Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, lost in 1940. Now that military fortune had clearly turned away from Germany, the voices of supporters of a separate peace were growing louder in Bucharest. King Michael I of Romania, despite his young age, was a far-sighted politician. He understood that continuing the war on Germany's side would lead the country to disaster. A group of opposition figures formed around the king, including representatives of all the major political parties, from liberals to communists. By the summer of 1944, the Romanian army was a formidable force, with about 600,000 men in 27 divisions. But the morale of the troops left much to be desired. Soldiers and officers did not understand what they were fighting for when their homeland was under threat of occupation. General Petre Dumitrescu's 3rd Romanian Army was located on the left flank of the southern Ukraine Army Group. It occupied a section of the front from Iasi to Galati, stretching for about 120 kilometers. The army included 8 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division, and several separate units, with a total strength of about 150,000 men. General Constantin Sănătescu's 4th Romanian Army defended the southern section of the front, from Galați to the Black Sea coast. It consisted of 6 infantry divisions and reinforcement units, with a total strength of about 120,000 men. This army was considered more reliable, as it directly defended the approaches to Bucharest. The Romanian divisions were armed with a variety of weapons. Along with modern German models, they used French, Czech, and even Soviet captured weapons. The lack of anti-tank weapons was particularly acute. The Romanian infantry had virtually no weapons capable of fighting the Soviet T-34 tanks. The German command did not particularly trust its allies. Romanian divisions received outdated weapons, were not allowed to participate in the most important sections of the front, and their officers were not privy to the details of operational plans. This attitude further cooled the already chilly relations between the allies. Communist and patriotic guerrilla units operated behind Romanian lines. They attacked communications, destroyed warehouses, and carried out sabotage. The guerrillas were particularly active in the mountainous regions of the Carpathians, where they established control over vast territories. Soviet intelligence closely monitored the mood in Romania. NKVD agents reported on preparations for an anti-German coup, on contacts between the opposition and Western allies, and on plans to withdraw the country from the war. This information was taken into account when planning the Jassy-Kishinev operation. German generals understood the unreliability of their Romanian ally, but there was nothing they could do about it. Germany simply did not have enough forces to defend the entire Eastern Front without the help of its allies. They had to put up with the low combat effectiveness of the Romanian troops and hope that they would at least delay the Soviet advance. Colonel General Freisner, commander of Army Group South Ukraine, repeatedly asked the High Command for permission to withdraw Romanian divisions to more advantageous positions. But Hitler categorically forbade any retreats, demanding that every kilometer of territory be held. Under these conditions, Romanian troops became the most vulnerable element of the German defense. The Soviet command understood this perfectly well and planned to deliver its main blows precisely to the areas defended by Germany's allies. The blow was to be so powerful that the Romanian divisions would be unable to offer serious resistance. But the main hope of the Soviet command was not the military defeat of Romania, but its political withdrawal from the war. If King Mihai could be persuaded to stage a coup, the entire Army Group South Ukraine would find itself in a catastrophic situation. Romanian troops would not only cease to resist, but could also turn their weapons against their former allies. Time was working against Germany. Every day of the war brought closer the moment when Romania would refuse to fight for someone else's interests. But would the Soviet troops be able to take advantage of this? On August 20th, 1944, at 5 a.m., Moscow time, the silence of the Moldovan morning was broken by the thunder of thousands of guns. The artillery preparation for the Jassy-Kishinev operation began, one of the most powerful in the history of the Great Patriotic War. The density of artillery per kilometer of breakthrough reached 300 barrels, a figure unheard of even by Soviet standards. The strike was delivered simultaneously from two directions. Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front attacked from the Jassy area in a southerly direction, seeking to break through to Foksani and cut off the enemy's retreat. Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front crossed the Dniester and advanced from the Kitskin bridgehead towards Kishinev. The artillery preparation lasted an hour and a half. Soviet artillerymen methodically destroyed German positions, suppressed firing points, and destroyed wire barriers. Particular attention was paid to combating enemy artillery. It was necessary to ensure the safety of the advancing troops. At 6:30 in the morning, the infantry went on the attack. Rifle divisions, supported by tanks and self-propelled artillery units, rushed towards German positions. Enemy resistance in many areas was weaker than expected. Romanian troops could not withstand the powerful artillery fire. In the sector of the Second Ukrainian Front's offensive, the first to break through were units of Lieutenant General Sergei Georgievich Trofimenko's 27th Army. After overcoming the enemy's first line of defense, Soviet troops rushed deep into enemy territory. By the end of the first day of the offensive, they had advanced 12 to 15 kilometers. The offensive of the Third Ukrainian Front was even more successful. Units of the 57th Army under Colonel General Mikhail Nikolaevich Sharokin, advancing from the Kitska bridgehead, broke through the German defenses by noon. The Romanian divisions defending this section offered virtually no resistance. The Air Force played a special role on the first day of the operation. 2,000 Soviet aircraft continuously attacked enemy positions, communications, and reserves. Il-2 ground attack aircraft destroyed German tanks and artillery. Bombers destroyed bridges and railway junctions, and fighters ensured air superiority. The German command tried to organize counterattacks, but all attempts failed. The reserves of Army Group South Ukraine were insufficient to eliminate the breakthroughs on such a wide front. Colonel General Frissner demanded additional forces from the higher command, but there simply were none. By the evening of August 20th, it became clear that the enemy's first line of defense had been broken through to its full depth. Soviet troops entered operational space and were able to develop their offensive at a rapid pace. Front commanders brought mobile groups, tank and mechanized corps, into battle. Lieutenant General Andrei Georgievich Kravchenko's 6th Tank Corps, operating in the Second Ukrainian Front, had advanced 25 kilometers by the end of the day. The tankers captured several important settlements and threatened enemy communications. Lieutenant General Boris Sergeyevich Bakarov's 18th Tank Corps was no less successful in the Third Ukrainian Front. Its units broke through the positions of the Romanian troops and rushed towards Kishinev. By evening, the Corps' advance units were only 40 kilometers from the Moldovan capital. The first day of the Jassy-Kishinev operation demonstrated the complete superiority of the Red Army over the enemy. The German-Romanian troops were unable to organize an effective defense and suffered heavy losses. The Romanian divisions fought particularly poorly. Many of them simply fled after the first artillery strike. But most importantly, the integrity of the enemy's defense was broken. Gaps formed, through which Soviet tank units rushed. The second stage of the operation began. the development of success, and the encirclement of the main forces of the Army Group South Ukraine. Colonel General Fresner understood the catastrophic nature of the situation, but still hoped to restore the situation. He did not know that this was only the beginning, that the Soviet marshals were preparing a strike that would completely destroy his group. Would the German general be able to organize a retreat, or would he fall into the trap set by Malinovsky and Tolbukhin? On August 21st, Soviet troops launched a rapid offensive across the entire front. The operation plan worked like clockwork. The German-Romanian defenses collapsed under the blows of tank corps, and infantry units consolidated the success achieved. In just one day, the front of Army Group South Ukraine was breached in several places. Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front delivered the main blow with the forces of the 27th, 52nd, and 53rd Armies. The direction of the attack was not chosen at random. It was here that the Romanian divisions, whose combat capabilities were seriously doubted, were defending. The calculation proved to be completely correct. The Romanian troops could not withstand the powerful blow and began to retreat. Lieutenant General Trofimenko's 27th Army was particularly successful. Its units broke through the enemy's defenses along a 30-kilometer stretch and advanced up to 40 kilometers. Dozens of settlements were liberated and important communications were captured. Kravchenko's 6th Tank Corps rushed into the breach. The tankers acted boldly and decisively, not allowing the enemy to gain a foothold at intermediate lines. In one day, the Corps advanced more than 50 kilometers, leaving the slowly advancing infantry far behind. Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front developed its offensive from the Kitskin bridgehead. The 57th and 37th Armies played the main role here. The resistance of the Romanian troops was minimal. Many divisions surrendered without a fight or simply scattered. Bakarev's 18th Tank Corps was rapidly approaching Kishinev. T-34 tanks and self-propelled artillery units broke through all enemy defenses and by the evening of August 21st had reached the approaches to the Moldovan capital. The fall of Kishinev was a matter of hours. The Air Force continued to deliver powerful blows to the retreating enemy troops. Attack aircraft and fighter bombers attacked columns of equipment, warehouses, and railway trains. The pilots were particularly effective against Romanian troops, who were retreating in panic across open terrain. The German command tried to organize resistance at intermediate lines, but all efforts were in vain. Soviet troops advanced too quickly, giving the enemy no time to organize their defenses. The classic positional war turned into a maneuver battle. Colonel General Fresner realized that the situation was getting out of control. He demanded permission from the headquarters of Army Group South to retreat across the Prut River, but received a categorical refusal. Hitler forbade any retreats, demanding that positions be held at all costs. In this situation, the German and Romanian troops found themselves in a critical position. The front had been broken in several places, communications were disrupted, and contact between units was lost. Many divisions operated in isolation, without accurate information about the position of their neighbors. The situation was particularly dire for General Dumitrescu's 3rd Romanian Army. Its divisions were defeated on the very first day of the offensive, and the remnants retreated in complete disorder. The army as an organized force practically ceased to exist. General De Angelis's 6th German Army attempted to counterattack, but its efforts were insufficient. German reserves were scattered across the entire front and were unable to deliver a concentrated strike. In addition, many units were engaged in combat with the advancing Soviet troops. By the end of the second day of the operation, it was clear that the German-Romanian defense had suffered a complete defeat. Soviet troops advanced 40 to 60 kilometers, liberated vast territories, and inflicted heavy losses on the enemy. But most importantly, an operational success had been achieved, which allowed the transition to the third stage of the operation, the encirclement of the main forces of Army Group South Ukraine. The pincers of the Soviet offensive began to close, threatening the complete destruction of the enemy. Friesner still did not understand the true scale of the disaster. He believed that he was dealing with a normal offensive that could be stopped with counterattacks. The German general did not know that he had fallen into a brilliantly conceived trap from which there was no escape. On August 22nd, the operation reached a critical moment. The Soviet Tank Corps, which had broken through deep into enemy defenses, were tasked with joining forces and closing the encirclement. The fate of the entire Army Group South Ukraine depended on the speed of their actions. Kravchenko's 6th Tank Corps, advancing from the north, turned southeast towards the city of Husi. The tankers moved through the Romanian rear, sweeping away individual units and warehouses in their path. Resistance was minimal. Romanian troops retreated in panic without attempting to organize a defense. Baharov's 18th Tank Corps was advancing toward them from the south. Its advance units had already stormed the outskirts of Kishinev, but the main forces received orders to bypass the Moldovan capital and move to join up with units of the Second Ukrainian Front. The distance between the advancing groups was shrinking by the hour. Despite their fatigue and lack of fuel, the Soviet tankers continued their rapid advance. They understood that the outcome of the entire operation depended on their actions. The German command finally realized the scale of the threat. Colonel General Friesner ordered all available reserves to prevent the Soviet tank groups from joining forces at any cost. The last serviceable tanks, anti-tank artillery, and even training units were thrown into battle. The 24th Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's best units, put up particularly desperate resistance. Its Panther tanks and Ferdinand self-propelled guns attempted to halt the advance of the 6th Panzer Corps. Fierce tank battles ensued, but the German efforts were doomed to failure. The Soviet tankers had overwhelming superiority in forces and acted more decisively. In addition, they were supported by the Air Force, which continuously attacked the German columns. At 2:30 in the afternoon on August 22nd, a historic event took place. The advanced units of the 6th and 18th Tank Corps met in the area of the village of Leova. The encirclement was complete. The main forces of Army Group South Ukraine found themselves in a huge cauldron between the Prut and Dniester rivers. The 6th and 8th German armies and the remnants of the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies were surrounded, totaling about 300,000 men. It was one of the largest enemy groups surrounded during the entire war. The scale of the encirclement exceeded even the Stalingrad cauldron. The Soviet command immediately set about eliminating the encircled troops. A strong defense was established on the outside of the ring, preventing the enemy from breaking through. On the inside, the methodical destruction of the trapped divisions began. Colonel General Friesner found himself in a hopeless situation. His headquarters were in Kishinev, which had already been stormed by Soviet troops. Communication with the encircled armies was lost, reserves were exhausted, and no outside help was expected. Attempts to break the encirclement of the trapped troops were unsuccessful. The German command did not have sufficient forces to break through such a dense ring. In addition, all available reserves were tied up in battles on other sections of the front. Chaos broke out among the encircled troops. Many Romanian units ceased resistance and laid down their arms. German units tried to break through in small groups, but all attempts ended in failure. Soviet troops controlled all roads and crossings. The situation with ammunition and fuel was particularly dire. The depots remained in the hands of Soviet troops, and air supply was practically impossible due to the dominance of Soviet aviation. Many tanks and self-propelled guns became inoperable due to a lack of fuel. The morale of the surrounded troops plummeted. Soldiers and officers understood the hopelessness of their situation and lost the will to resist. Cases of desertion became more frequent, especially among Romanian servicemen. Soviet troops, on the contrary, were inspired by their success. Soldiers and commanders understood that they were participating in a historic operation that could radically change the course of the war in the southern direction. The pace of the offensive did not slow down for a single hour. By the end of the third day of the operation, it was clear that the Jassy-Kishinev Cannae had been a complete success. The Soviet marshals repeated Hannibal's feat, but in modern conditions and with even more impressive results. All that remained was to complete the rout and count the spoils of this outstanding victory. On August 24, 1944, Kishinev, the capital of the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic, was liberated from the German-Romanian invaders. The fall of the city marked the symbolic end of the first stage of the Jassy-Kishinev offensive and paved the way for a further advance into the Balkans. The assault on Kishinev began at dawn on August 23rd. The city was defended by units of the 24th Tank Division and the remnants of Romanian formations totaling about 15,000 men. The German command understood the strategic importance of the Moldovan capital and was prepared to fight for every street. Soviet troops approached the city from three sides. Units of the 20th Army advanced from the North, 7th Army advanced from the north, units of the 57th Army from the east, and tankers of the 18th Tank Corps from the south. This formation made it impossible for the defenders to retreat. The first strike was delivered on the outskirts of the city. Soviet artillerymen fired accurately at resistance centers, trying not to damage residential areas and historical monuments. Assault troops attacked German tanks and self-propelled guns entrenched in buildings. Particularly, fierce fighting broke out in the area around the railway station and the city center. German tankers turned stone buildings into impregnable fortresses and put up stubborn resistance. Every house had to be taken by storm. Soviet soldiers showed incredible heroism during the assault on the city. Sappers blew holes in the walls of buildings, snipers destroyed enemy firing points, and assault groups stormed buildings and engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the defenders. By the evening of August 23rd, Soviet troops had captured most of the city. German units were divided into separate pockets of resistance and lost their ability to coordinate their actions. Many Romanian units laid down their arms and surrendered. The last pocket of resistance was suppressed on the morning of August 24th. The remnants of the 24th Tank Division attempted to break out of the city, but were surrounded and destroyed. More than 5,000 enemy soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. The liberation of Chisinau was of enormous political significance. The Moldovan people welcomed the Soviet soldiers as liberators. Red flags appeared in the streets of the city, and residents came out to meet the Soviet tanks with flowers and bread and salt. The liberators were given a particularly warm welcome by representatives of the Moldovan intelligentsia. Many of them had waited 3 years for this day, hiding from the Romanian authorities or living underground. Now they could openly express their feelings. Traces of the occupiers' atrocities were found in the city. The German and Romanian authorities carried out a policy of genocide against the Jewish population, killed thousands of civilians, and plundered cultural treasures. Many historic buildings were turned into military facilities. But most importantly, the fall of Chisinau meant the complete collapse of the defenses of the South Ukraine Army Group. The loss of the regional capital demoralized the enemy troops and hastened the surrender of the Romanian units. Many divisions simply ceased resistance. The Soviet command immediately took advantage of this success to advance their offensive. Through the liberated Chisinau, they began to transfer reserves to the west, towards the Romanian border. The city became an important logistical center, providing supplies to the advancing troops. On the same day, August 24th, dramatic events took place in Bucharest. King Michael I arrested Marshal Antonescu and announced Romania's withdrawal from the war. This news spread like wildfire across the front and completely demoralized the Romanian troops. The fall of Kishinev and the coup in Bucharest became a turning point not only for the Jassy-Kishinev operation, but also for the entire war on the southern section of the Eastern Front. Germany lost its last major ally, and the Red Army gained the opportunity to advance into the Balkans. Colonel General Frisner understood that his group was doomed. Communication with the High Command had been lost, reserves were exhausted, and an ally had switched sides to the enemy. The German general could only try to save the remnants of his troops, but even that was becoming increasingly difficult. Soviet Marshals Malinovsky and Tolbukhin celebrated their triumph. Their operation exceeded all expectations and became one of the most brilliant in military history. But there was still much work ahead. It was necessary to complete the defeat of the enemy and build on the success in the western direction. On August 25, 1944, Army Group South Ukraine ceased to exist as an organized military force. In 5 days of the Jassy-Kishinev offensive, one of the largest Wehrmacht groups was completely destroyed, an event unprecedented in military history in terms of the speed and scale of the enemy's destruction. 280,000 soldiers and officers found themselves surrounded in a giant cauldron between the Prut and Dniester rivers. General De Angelis's 6th German Army, General Wöhler's 8th German Army, and the remnants of the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies, all these forces were doomed to destruction or capture. Attempts to break through the encirclement were made repeatedly, but all ended in failure. The Soviet troops created such a dense defense that even separate groups were unable to slip through the barricades. Attempts to remove heavy weapons were particularly hopeless. The 24th Panzer Division, an elite Wehrmacht unit, was destroyed while defending Kishinev. Its Panthers and Tigers, which had recently struck terror into the enemy, were reduced to piles of metal under the blows of Soviet tankers and assault troops. The situation of the Romanian troops was particularly catastrophic. After the coup in Bucharest, they were effectively left without any leadership. Many divisions simply laid down their arms, unwilling to fight for the interests of yesterday's allies. Officers removed their epaulets and tried to hide among the local population. It became impossible to supply the surrounded troops. All ammunition and food depots were in the hands of Soviet troops. Attempts to organize an air bridge failed. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft artillery made flights over the cauldron extremely dangerous. The German Air Force made desperate attempts to help those surrounded. Transport planes tried to drop cargo by parachute, but most of the containers fell into the hands of Soviet troops. The losses of the Air Force were enormous. More than 150 aircraft were shot down in 3 days. General De Angelis, commander of the Sixth Army, attempted to organize a breakthrough to the south. The remnants of German tank units attacked Soviet infantry positions, but were stopped by anti-tank artillery. The attempt at a breakthrough cost the Germans their last serviceable tanks. The morale of the surrounded troops declined with each passing hour. Soviet intelligence radio intercepts recorded panic among German soldiers and officers. Many units began to abandon their positions without permission, attempting to break through to their own lines in small groups. The command of Army Group South Ukraine had effectively lost control of its troops. Colonel General Frisner and his staff were completely surrounded and unable to coordinate the actions of the scattered units. Radio communications were intermittent, and landline communications were completely disrupted. By the evening of August 25th, the resistance of the German-Romanian troops began to take on a localized character. Individual groups continued to fight with the desperation of the doomed, but there was no longer any overall defense plan. Soviet troops methodically eliminated one pocket of resistance after another. Particularly fierce fighting broke out in the area around the city of Husi, where the remnants of several German divisions had entrenched themselves. Here, the Germans attempted to create a last line of defense, but Soviet tankers, supported by artillery and aviation, broke the resistance in a matter of hours. The tragedy of Army Group South Ukraine was complete. In 5 days of fighting, it lost more than 300,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. 3,000 guns, 400 tanks and self-propelled artillery units, and a huge amount of military equipment were destroyed or captured. Soviet losses were incomparably smaller. Brilliant planning of the operation, the surprise of the attack, and the skillful use of tank units made it possible to achieve the result with minimal bloodshed. The ratio of losses was 1-20 in favor of the Red Army, a unique indicator in military history. The defeat of Army Group South Ukraine was one of the Wehrmacht's greatest disasters of the entire Second World War. In terms of the scale of losses, it surpassed even the Battle of Stalingrad. Germany lost not only a huge number of troops, but also its last major ally in Europe. The Jassy-Kishinev offensive demonstrated the highest level of Soviet military artistry. Marshals Malinovsky and Tolbukhin managed to repeat Hannibal's classic Cannae victory, but in the conditions of modern warfare and with even more impressive results. For the German command, the disaster in Moldova came as a complete surprise. Hitler and his generals did not expect the Red Army to be capable of such a perfect encirclement operation. The myth of the invincibility of the German war machine was finally dispelled. But the main consequences of the Jassy-Kishinev operation were yet to be assessed. The defeat of Army Group South Ukraine opened the way for the Red Army to the Balkans and created the conditions for the liberation of the whole of southeastern Europe. On August 23, 1944, a drama unfolded in the Royal Palace in Bucharest that radically changed the course of the war in the Balkans. King Michael I of Romania, with the support of opposition politicians, staged a coup d'état, arrested Marshal Ion Antonescu, and announced the country's withdrawal from the war on the side of Germany. Preparations for the coup were carried out in strict secrecy over several months. Despite being only 22 years old, King Michael proved himself to be a far-sighted politician. He understood that Romania's continued participation in the war on the side of Germany would lead the country to complete disaster. Representatives of all the main political forces, from liberals to communists, rallied around the king. Liberal leader Constantin Brătianu, Social Democrat Constantin Titulescu, and communist Lucrețiu Pătrășcanu. All of them, despite their ideological differences, were united in their desire to withdraw Romania from the war. The impetus for action came with news of the catastrophic defeat of Romanian troops in Moldova. Reports from the front painted an apocalyptic picture. Entire divisions ceased to exist. Soldiers surrendered en masse, and officers removed their epaulets and abandoned their units. On the morning of August 23rd, King Mihai invited Marshal Antonescu to an audience at the royal palace. Officially, the purpose was to discuss the military situation, but in reality, the conspirators were preparing a trap for the dictator. Guardsmen were hiding in the waiting room, ready to arrest the marshal at a signal. The conversation between the king and the marshal was tense. Mihai demanded an immediate armistice with the Soviet Union and withdrawal from the war. Antonescu categorically refused, declaring his loyalty to the alliance with Germany. Then the king gave the signal, and the guards burst into the hall. Antonescu's arrest went without resistance. The marshal understood the hopelessness of the situation and did not resist. He was imprisoned in the basement of the royal palace and then transferred to prison. Along with the dictator, his closest associates were also arrested. Immediately after Antonescu's arrest, the king addressed the nation on the radio. He announced the cessation of hostilities against the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States of America. Romania not only withdrew from the war, but also turned its weapons against its former allies. The new government was headed by General Constantin Sănescu, an experienced military leader and opponent of pro-German policies. The cabinet's first decision was to order Romanian troops to cease resistance to Soviet forces and prepare for joint action against the Germans. The news of the coup in Bucharest struck the German command like a bolt from the blue. Hitler flew into a rage and ordered the immediate occupation of Romania, the arrest of the king, and the restoration of Antonescu's power. But there were simply not enough forces to do so. German troops in Romania were few in number and could not control the entire country. In addition, they were demoralized by their defeat in Moldova and were not eager to fight against their former allies. Many German garrisons simply surrendered to Romanian troops. The coup in Bucharest had enormous strategic consequences. Germany lost its last major ally in Europe and lost Romanian oil, an essential resource for waging war. The loss of the Ploiesti oil fields was a severe blow to the German economy. Even more important was the geopolitical significance of the Romanian coup. The Red Army was able to enter Romania unhindered and advance into the Balkans. Bulgaria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, all these countries were within reach of Soviet troops. For Army Group South Ukraine, the coup in Bucharest was the final nail in the coffin. Romanian troops not only ceased resistance, but also began to defect to the enemy. The remnants of the German units found themselves completely isolated. King Michael proved himself to be a wise ruler, capable of making the only correct decision at a critical moment. His actions saved Romania from complete ruin and allowed the country to switch sides to the Allies relatively painlessly. But the coup in Bucharest was not only a political act, but also a military operation. Romanian troops were ordered to capture German garrisons, block retreating Wehrmacht units, and assist the Red Army's offensive. Yesterday's allies became sworn enemies. The events of August 23rd in Bucharest were the logical conclusion of the Jassy-Kishinev operation. The military defeat led to a political coup, which in turn exacerbated the military catastrophe. A chain reaction was set in motion. and it was already impossible to stop it. On August 28, 1944, the last pockets of enemy resistance in Moldova were eliminated. The Jassy-Kishinev operation ended in a complete victory for the Red Army. In 8 days of fighting, the entire territory of the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic was liberated. One of the largest Wehrmacht groups was defeated, and the way to the Balkans was opened. The final stage of the operation took place in an atmosphere of complete collapse of the enemy. The German units that survived the encirclement tried to break through to the west in small groups, but all attempts ended in failure. Soviet troops controlled all roads and crossings, turning the retreat into a disorderly flight. The fate of the remnants of the 6th German Army was particularly dramatic. General De Angelis attempted to organize a breakthrough in the area of the city of Foxani, gathering all the surviving tanks and self-propelled guns. But Soviet anti-tank units met the Germans with heavy fire, and the Air Force delivered devastating blows to the columns of equipment. By August 27th, more than 200,000 enemy soldiers and officers were already in Soviet captivity. The prisoner of war camps were overcrowded, and new ones had to be created. Many prisoners were in shock from the scale of the disaster. After the coup in Bucharest, Romanian troops defected en masse to the Red Army. Entire divisions surrendered without a fight, and their commanders offered their services to the new government. This greatly facilitated the task of Soviet troops in clearing the territory. The liberation of Moldovan villages and towns was accompanied by jubilation among the local population. Residents welcomed Soviet soldiers as liberators, decorated their homes with red flags, and organized public celebrations. Children, who were seeing T-34 tanks for the first time in 3 years, gave the soldiers a particularly warm welcome. Soviet power was immediately restored in the liberated areas. Party organizations came out of hiding, temporary administrations were set up, and schools and hospitals began to function. Local communists, who had been hiding from the Romanian police for 3 years, could finally engage in political activity openly. The discoveries made by Soviet troops in the liberated areas were tragic. The occupiers had killed thousands of civilians, looted museums and libraries, and reduced many historical monuments to ruins. The Jewish population suffered particularly badly, as the Romanian authorities had pursued a policy of genocide. The Red Army's engineering troops immediately began to restore the destroyed communications. Sappers cleared roads and bridges of mines, restored river crossings, and re-established rail traffic. The pace of the restoration work was remarkable. Particular attention was paid to helping the local population. Field kitchens fed hungry children, military medics treated the sick, and quartermaster services distributed clothing and shoes. Soviet commanders strictly suppressed any attempts at looting or violence against civilians. Moldova's agriculture was in a catastrophic state. 3 years of occupation and military action had caused enormous damage. Many villages had been burned, crops trampled, and livestock stolen. A colossal task of rebuilding the economy lay ahead. The political situation in liberated Moldova was complicated. Part of the population supported Soviet power, but there were also those who sympathized with Romanian nationalists or advocated independence. The Soviet command had to be cautious and flexible. The military trophies captured during the operation were enormous. Soviet troops seized hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns, thousands of vehicles, and a huge amount of small arms and ammunition. Many examples of German equipment were sent to the rear for study. The strategic importance of the liberation of Moldova cannot be overestimated. The The Red Army not only recaptured an important economic region, but also created a springboard for a further offensive in the Balkans. The road to Bucharest, Sofia, and Belgrade was open. The Jassy-Kishinev offensive demonstrated a new level of Soviet military artistry. The combination of strategic planning, tactical skill, and technical superiority made it possible to achieve outstanding results with minimal losses. For the Moldovan people, August 28, 1944, became the day of their second birth. 3 years of occupation, terror, and humiliation had come to an end. Moldova was once again Soviet, and its inhabitants could look to the future with optimism. But the main events were still ahead. The liberation of Moldova was only the first stage of the Red Army's grand offensive in the Balkans. Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Hungary were next. Soviet marshals were preparing new operations that would complete the liberation of Europe from fascism. The results of the Jassy-Kishinev operation were astonishing even to seasoned Soviet generals. In 8 days of fighting, a force of more than 800,000 men was defeated, and trophies comparable to the military potential of an entire state were captured. The ratio of losses of 1 to 20 in favor of the Red Army was unprecedented in world military history. The enemy's human losses were catastrophic. The German-Romanian troops lost about 80,000 men killed, more than 100,000 wounded, and 208,000 captured. Of the 22 divisions of Army Group South Ukraine, 18 were completely destroyed, and the rest lost their combat capability. Thousands of pieces of equipment were captured. Soviet troops seized 390 tanks and self-propelled artillery units, 2,800 guns and mortars, 7,000 machine guns, and 100,000 rifles and submachine guns. The latest German weapons were particularly valuable. Among the captured tanks were Panthers and Tigers, considered the best in the world. Soviet designers were able to study German technology in detail and use it to create their own models. Many of these solutions were subsequently used in post-war tank construction. Artillery trophies included guns of all calibers, from anti-tank guns to heavy howitzers. Of particular interest were the Nebelwerfer rocket launchers and Flak anti-aircraft guns. These systems were studied in research institutes and influenced the development of Soviet artillery. Automotive trophies amounted to more than 10,000 vehicles of various types. These were not only military trucks and passenger cars, but also special equipment, radio stations, searchlight installations, and repair workshops. Many vehicles were put into service with the Red Army. The captured warehouses contained huge stocks of ammunition, fuel, food, and uniforms. More than 50,000 tons of ammunition alone were captured, enough to supply an entire army for a month. This allowed the Soviets to save a significant amount of resources. Documentary trophies were no less valuable. Soviet intelligence got its hands on German defense plans, encryption codes, personal files of officers, and minefield maps. This information was used in planning further operations and gave a huge advantage. Among the prisoners were high-ranking officers, including several generals. Their interrogations yielded valuable information about the plans of the German command, the state of the Wehrmacht, and the mood in Germany. Many prisoners willingly cooperated with the Soviet side. Romanian prisoners of war constituted a special category. After the coup in Bucharest, many of them expressed a desire to fight against Germany. They were formed into volunteer units that participated in further combat operations on the side of the Allies. The economic significance of the trophies was enormous. The captured material assets were estimated to be worth billions of rubles at pre-war prices. This made it possible to partially compensate for the damage caused by the occupiers to the Soviet economy. Many enterprises received additional equipment and raw materials. The scientific and technical value of the trophies was no less important. Soviet specialists gained access to the latest German developments in the field of weapons, communications, and radar. The study of the captured samples accelerated the development of domestic science and technology. The propaganda effect of the trophies was enormous. Photographs of captured equipment, columns of prisoners, and piles of weapons were published in the world press. They clearly demonstrated the power of the Red Army and the approaching final victory over fascism. For the German command, the loss of such a large number of equipment and personnel was a disaster. It was impossible to make up for these losses. The Reich's industry could no longer provide the army with the necessary amount of weapons, and human resources were running out. The trophies were distributed in accordance with established procedures. Some were transferred to the Allies under Lend-Lease, some went to the troops that participated in the operation, and some were sent to the rear for study and copying. Each piece of equipment was accounted for and used as efficiently as possible. The trophies of the Jassy-Kishinev operation became a symbol of the triumph of Soviet weapons. They clearly demonstrated the superiority of the Red Army over the Wehrmacht and brought the day of final victory closer. The captured weapons would still be used in the battles for the liberation of Europe. But the main trophy of the operation was not equipment, but strategic success. The defeat of Army Group South Ukraine opened the way to the Balkans and created the conditions for the liberation of all of Southeast Europe. It was a victory that changed the course of the war. The Jassy-Kishinev offensive went down in military history as a model encirclement operation. Soviet military theorists immediately began to analyze the factors of success in order to apply the accumulated experience in future battles. The operation was unofficially named Jassy-Kishinev Cannae, in honor of Hannibal's famous battle. The main lesson of the operation was the importance of careful planning and secrecy in preparation. The Soviet command managed to concentrate superior forces precisely where the enemy did not expect them. Disinformation measures completely misled German intelligence. The coordination of the two fronts was exemplary. Marshals Malinovsky and Tolbukhin acted as a single entity, synchronizing their strikes and preventing the enemy from maneuvering their reserves. This required tremendous work by the staffs and flawless communication between the commands. The role of tank units in the operation was decisive. It was the mobile groups that ensured the rapid development of success and the closing of the encirclement. Soviet tankers demonstrated the highest level of skill, covering 50 to 60 kilometers a day across rough terrain. The artillery preparation became a classic example of firepower. The density of artillery, 300 barrels per kilometer of breakthrough, was record-breaking even by Soviet standards. Methodical suppression of enemy strongpoints ensured minimal losses for the advancing troops. The interaction between the different branches of the armed forces reached an unprecedented level. Infantry, tanks, artillery, and aviation acted as a single unit. The use of assault aviation to support tank breakthroughs and destroy retreating enemy columns was particularly effective. The most important factor in the success was the moral superiority of the Red Army. Soviet soldiers fought for the liberation of their homeland, which gave them additional strength. At the same time, the enemy's morale was undermined by previous defeats and the unreliability of their Romanian allies. Reconnaissance played a huge role in the success of the operation. Soviet scouts accurately identified weaknesses in the enemy's defenses, revealed the location of reserves, and established the low combat capabilities of the Romanian troops. This information formed the basis for planning the operation. Logistical support for the operation was organized at the highest level. Despite the long distances and the fast pace of the offensive, the troops had no shortage of ammunition, fuel, or food. The quartermaster's services worked with clockwork precision. The political component of the operation proved to be no less important than the military one. The coup in Bucharest was a logical consequence of the military successes and greatly facilitated the task of the Soviet troops. Skillful diplomatic work accelerated Romania's exit from the war. The operation demonstrated a new level of Soviet military artistry. The Red Army learned to conduct the most complex encirclement operations, which were not inferior in design and execution to the best examples in world military history. This was a qualitative development in combat skills. The impact of the Jassy-Kishinev operation on the course of the war cannot be overestimated. The defeat of Army Group South Ukraine opened the way to the Balkans and accelerated the liberation of all of Southeast Europe. The strategic initiative finally passed to the Allies. For the German command, the operation came as a shock. Hitler and his generals did not expect the Red Army to be capable of such perfect actions. The myth of the superiority of German military art was finally dispelled, which had serious psychological consequences. The experience of the operation was carefully studied and applied in subsequent battles. The Vistula Oder, East Prussian, and Berlin operations used the same principles as the Jassy-Kishinev Cannae. This hastened the end of the war and reduced Allied losses. The international significance of the operation was enormous. The Western Allies received clear confirmation of the power of the Red Army and the Soviet Union's ability to defeat Nazi Germany on its own. This strengthened the USSR's position in negotiations on the post-war world order. The theoretical significance of the operation went far beyond World War II. The principles applied in Moldova were studied in military academies around the world and influenced the development of military art for decades. The Jassy-Kishinev Can became a classic of strategy. The operation showed that in modern conditions, it is possible to repeat the classic techniques of antiquity, but at a new technical level. Hannibal surrounded the Romans at Cannae, using his superior cavalry. Soviet marshals achieved the same result by using tanks and aircraft. The success of the Jassy-Kishinev operation opened up completely new strategic prospects for the Red Army. The defeat of Army Group South Ukraine and Romania's withdrawal from the war radically changed the situation on the entire southern section of the Eastern Front. The road to the Balkans was open, and the Soviet command was preparing to liberate all of Southeast Europe. On August 30th, the vanguard of the Red Army crossed the Romanian border and rushed towards Bucharest. There was virtually no resistance. Romanian troops either surrendered or defected to the Allies. Many cities opened their gates to Soviet tanks without a single shot being fired. On August 31st, Soviet troops entered Bucharest. The Romanian capital was liberated with virtually no fighting. The population welcomed the Soviet soldiers as liberators, and the streets were decorated with red flags. King Michael officially declared war on Germany and offered the Romanian army to the Allies. The fall of Bucharest was of enormous political significance. Romania finally broke with Germany and became an ally of the anti-Hitler coalition. This set a precedent for other Balkan countries and accelerated the collapse of Hitler's bloc in Southeast Europe. The Soviet command immediately took advantage of the favorable situation to develop its offensive. Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front was tasked with advancing towards Hungary, while Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front was to advance on Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. Bulgaria found itself in a critical situation. This country was formally an ally of Germany, but did not wage war against the USSR. The Bulgarian government tried to take a neutral position, but the approach of the Red Army made such a policy impossible. On September 8th, Bulgaria declared war on Germany and appealed to the Soviet Union for a truce. On September 9th, a coup took place in Sofia, and the Fatherland Front government came to power. Bulgaria became an ally of the anti-Hitler coalition. Yugoslavia presented a special problem. This country was occupied by German troops, but powerful partisan forces under the command of Josip Broz Tito were active there. The Soviet command coordinated its actions with the Yugoslav patriots. On October 20th, Soviet troops, supported by Yugoslav partisans, liberated Belgrade. The capital of Yugoslavia was taken as a result of a brilliant operation involving Red Army Tank Corps and the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia. Hungary put up the most stubborn resistance. Miklos Horthy's government remained loyal to Germany and was prepared to fight to the end. The German command transferred significant forces to Hungary, including SS tank divisions. Fighting in Hungary continued until the spring of 1945. Particularly fierce battles took place for Budapest, which Soviet troops stormed for several months. The Hungarian operation became one of the bloodiest in the final period of the war. The liberation of the Balkans was of enormous geopolitical significance. The Soviet Union gained access to the southern seas and influence in a strategically important region. This radically changed the balance of power in Europe and laid the foundations for the post-war world order. For the peoples of the Balkans, the Red Army's offensive meant liberation from the fascist yoke. Millions of people gained their freedom and the opportunity to build a new life. Many countries in the region embarked on the path of socialist development. The strategic consequences of the Jassy-Kishinev offensive continued to be felt until the very end of the war. The German command was forced to transfer troops from other sections of the front to stabilize the situation in the Balkans. This facilitated the actions of the Allies on all fronts. The economic consequences were no less important. Germany lost access to Romanian oil, Balkan mines, and the region's agricultural resources. This accelerated the economic collapse of the Third Reich and brought the end of the war closer. The military technical significance of the operation went beyond the specific battle. The Red Army demonstrated its ability to conduct complex encirclement operations in any conditions. This demoralized the enemy and inspired the Allies. The diplomatic consequences of the operation were long-term. The Red Army's successes in the Balkans strengthened the Soviet Union's position in negotiations with its Western allies. This influenced the decisions of the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. The Jassy-Kishinev operation became a turning point not only in the Great Patriotic War, but also in the entire Second World War. It opened the final stage of the fight against fascism and brought the long-awaited victory closer. The road to the Balkans became the road to peace. Marshals Malinovsky and Tolbukhin went down in history as the creators of one of the most perfect operations in military art. Their names are forever linked with the triumph of Soviet arms and the liberation of the peoples of Europe from the fascist yoke.